Hello everybody, my name is Debora Rother and I'm a biologist fascinated by plant-animal interactions and restoration ecology. Currently, I'm very interested in understanding how network theory can be applied to solve ecological questions in agroecosystems. I was part of this amazing research group for 2 years, and unfortunately, I was not able to attend the symposium in person, but this record is to talk a little about our study. Entitled Spatial Networks Review How Landscape Complexity Directly and Indirectly Decreases the Spread of Agricultural Pests. There are several records in the literature saying that large-scale production focused on monoculture creates the perfect conditions for crop specialists spread in the space. And researchers have shown that reduction of vegetation, together with the overuse of agrochemicals and the simplification of the landscapes, are the main cause of the decline of natural enemies of pests and its spreading in agroecosystems. By 2050, it is estimated that the range size of invasive terrestrial invertebrates, including crop pests, will increase on average by 18%. Thus, it is important to develop novel modeling approaches to understand and manage or prevent pest dispersal across landscapes. Observing the importance of vegetation in agricultural landscapes, understanding how forests can reshape the pest flow across the space becomes urgent for addressing applied issues, for example, the pest management in agroecosystems. Modeling approaches for agricultural pests have focused mainly on population dynamics and interactions with natural enemies, risk of invasion to other areas, and the environmental drivers affecting pest dispersal. A remaining challenge is to develop approaches to predict how features of agricultural landscapes affect pest spread. Based on this, is critical in regions dominated by monocultures, as the dispersal of pests is rapid and may be affected by small changes in landscape complexity. Based on this background, we developed a new approach integrating spatial network with mathematical modeling to understand how landscape complexity may affect the spread of species across regions dominated by monocultures. And more specifically, we explored three problems. One, the role of forest patches in modifying the structure of the spatial network through which species spread. Two, how these modifications in the spatial network structure affect the infestation dynamics of pests, and direct and indirect pathways among sites in the spatial network to predict the most vulnerable sites to pest infestations in the landscape. Assuming impermeability of the forest patches to the pest species and assuming the pest dispersal distance, we show in this study how the complexity of the landscape in terms of cover of natural and restored forests changes the spread of species, changes the spread of pests. Okay? The studied landscape is located in a region between two vegetation domains, Atlantic Forest and Savanna, in São Paulo State, Brazil. The region is covered by about 15% of vegetation. The region presents high biodiversity in terms of fauna and flora and several endemisms, and it is considered one of the most threatened in the country. The landscape is a mosaic composed by intensively cultivated sugarcane stands interspersed with patches of vegetation. Our reference system is composed by natural forests and restored forests, and also 1,089 points with traps used to monitor a population of the population of Dieteria saccharalis in the sugarcane patches. Sugarcane is an important crop in Latin America that suffers from infestations of the sugarcane borer, Dieteria saccharalis. To better understand our reference system, it's important knowing the biology of this moth that is widely distributed across Brazilian territory and is considered one of the most important pests in sugarcane belts. Damage caused by its larvae in the internodes of the cones may lead the plant to death, reducing the crop productivity. In general, males of Dieteria saccharalis disperse more than females, reaching a maximum distance of 800 meters in flight. This figure illustrates the traps for males placed in the sugarcane patches, and traps correspond to our 1,089 sample points. Okay? The first step of our work was to obtain the empirical forest cover of the region from the map biomes database and process each image. In the shapefile, as shown in the figure, we maintained all polygons classified as natural or restored forests. In this figure, I wanted to show you how the layer used to the next steps looks like. To simulate different scenarios of forest cover, we progressively enlarged and reduced the area of each forest polygon of the empirical landscape, and the simulations resulted in 50 scenarios varying from 2.59% to 98.8% of forest cover. The figure is to illustrate the complexity of the landscape by varying the vegetation cover, represented by green. The vegetation cover is represented by green and points by red. In each simulated scenario, we depicted the agroecosystem as a weighted spatial network. The network was constructed from those 1,089 points. And in the spatial network, each sample point is a node that is connected to other points. The weight of the connection between a given point E and another J corresponds to the distance that separates the points in the landscape. We calculated this distance among points, assuming that patches of vegetation are barriers that prevents a straight line pathway. As forest cover increases or reduces, the distance between points can vary as well between scenarios. To evaluate how the structure of spatial networks differed among scenarios, we used two metrics: average shortest path length and number of isolated components. To understand how the complexity of the landscape affects how moths spread across the landscape, we used stochastic discrete time spatially explicit model, and in the model we assumed that the agricultural system can be divided in n discrete patches of sugarcane that are connected across the space. And these connections therefore create pathways through which moths can spread. To perform the analysis, we assume that the propagation dynamic depends on the distance among points. That is, the closer a given point is to other, the stronger is their connection, and the infestation can more easily propagate between them. Okay? We also defined that the probability of a point to spread the infestation to another point is proportional to their connection strength relative to all other points connected to it. Okay? Under this assumption, we modeled the probability of a given point to get infested from one time step to another. And here we have an animation for the first time steps in this figure. To verify the moth spread between sites, we ran 2,000 numerical simulations of our model to each scenario of forest cover. In the simulations, we parameterized the distance between points with the distances between points of the different scenarios of forest cover. The maximum flight distance of the moths was parameterized with records from the literature, considering almost 800 meters. It is important to say that each simulation began with one random point being assigned as the initial focus of infestation. During each simulation, we recorded the time at which each point was infested, and at the end of the simulation, we recorded the proportion of infested points. To predict the trajectory of the infestation, we tested whether direct and the indirect effects among points in each spatial network can be used to predict the trajectory of the infestation of the numerical simulations. Okay? For that, we used random forests to evaluate the efficacy of direct and indirect effects in predicting the trajectory. In this figure, we have the percentage of forest cover in the landscape and how it affects the structure of the network. In the panel A, we have the average shortest path distance among points, and the panel B, the number of isolated components in agro-ecosystem spatial networks. The dashed line of both panels indicates the empirical scenario with 16.70% of forest cover. We found that both metrics in the spatial network increases with the forest cover. The largest increases occurred in scenarios in which the forest cover in the landscape was higher. Therefore, the important message here is that increasing the forest cover can increase the distance that pests need to cover to disperse to other points, also increase the number of locations that pests cannot reach in agroecosystems, and the empirical forest cover, represented here by 16%, shows this forest cover shows not be the most appropriate scenario for arrest the pest spread. Next, we evaluated whether the increases in the two network metrics can render the infestation of pests across the agroecosystem. In the figure, it represented the role of the vegetation cover on the mean time of infestation in the panel A and the proportion of infested points in the panel B. We found that increasing the forest cover of the landscape slowed down and decreased the number of points in the agroecosystem reached by the infestation. In other words, when the forest cover increases, pest infestation are slowed down and can reach a smaller number of points in the agroecosystem. In this figure, we show the coefficient of determination between random forests predictions and the actual values of the time step at which points were infested. We found that the random forests models predicted the trajectory of the infestation with up to 86.61% of precision, showing that the pest spreading is highly predictable. It is interesting that indirect pathways were more important than the direct effects and the initial focus of infestation. That means that pathways not interacting directly can strongly influence the trajectory of pest infestations in agroecosystems. Therefore, by considering both direct and indirect pathways through the spatial networks, our model can predict with an accuracy of nearly 80% the most susceptible points to pest infestation. Now, moving towards the end of this presentation, it's important to say that our results on pest spatial network, on spatial dynamic, draws attention to the fact that the current vegetation cover is not enough to stop the spread of the pest. The empirical forest cover, almost 16%, shows not to be the most appropriate scenario for arrest the pest spread, which could be translated in the combination of large investment in pest control and crop yields losses. Another important consideration is that forest cover is evidenced here to have a strong influence on pest spread into sugarcane matrices. It is a challenge, however, finding the ideal forest cover that permits a balance between ecological and economical values to design more friendly landscape. And the main implication of the network organization in spatial systems is that points have indirect connections to other points by several alternative paths. And this approach can be used to predict the most susceptible points in the landscape. In an applied context, and to finish this presentation, using only information about the direct and indirect pathways of the spatial network and the initial focus of infestation, we were able to predict with nearly 80% accuracy the most susceptible sites to pest infestation in the landscape. So, um, our model can be easily applied for other agricultural systems, showing that forest cover can effectively be used to control pest occupancy. 2. Direct and indirect pathways in spatial networks can be used as a predictive tool to manage the spread of pests in agricultural landscapes. And 3. This approach can provide scientific evidence to guide conservation and restoration plans and contribute to public policy discussions in the field of sustainable agriculture. I thank the financial support granted to us in this project, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity of working with this group. Thanks for your attention.